Morning, everyone. We're just going to give it a few moments for all the attendees to come in, and we'll get started in just a minute. Good morning, and thank you for joining us for session 3 in this 3-part series on the NJDEP tree removal and replacement ordinance and tree removal and replacement ordinances throughout municipalities in New Jersey. So we're happy again for our 3rd time here to be partnering NJAPZA with the New Jersey Shade Tree Federation for session 3 in this series. So some of you have been with us throughout the series here, and some of you are joining us today as you're interested in the enforcement and permit process that'll go along with this requirement. I'm Christina Schwartz. I'm the Executive Director of the NJPZA, and I'm the Land Use Director in Reddington Township and Hunterdon County. We're excited to have you with us today. Session 3 most closely aligns with what my role is at my municipality, currently as the zoning official for this aspect of it. And I'm excited to work with you today and share some of my experiences along with the rest of the panel in working with a tree removal and replacement ordinance at the municipal level. So before we get started, I'd like to cover a few administrative items for today's session. As with the previous sessions, if you are looking to get credit for today's session, you will want to stay on for the entire session. We verify that with the Zoom webinar report. So we'll be able to see your time in the session and assign you a credit certificate for today. Session 1 and 2, those certificates are done. We've decided to release them all at the end of the series. So if you've participated in previous sessions, don't worry, we have that recorded and you will be getting those emails as well. This will all come out via email with a separate certificate for each session you may have participated in. Submitting questions. Today, if you have any questions that you'd like to submit for us to address with the panel, please use the Q&A function. So chat is disabled, but Q&A is where we're going to be looking to get questions from the audience today. The post-session materials. So there's going to be an email following today's session that's going to have a link to today's recording, the PowerPoint slides, and also links to any resources or things that we've mentioned. So don't worry about taking too many notes or worrying about that as you listen and follow along today. That will all come to you via email. I will say that if you do not see that by tomorrow evening, please check your spam filters or any junk folders, as there's attachments and links. So a lot of the people participated in past sessions, that's where they found it when they didn't have it and reached out. So do check there if you don't see it by tomorrow evening, but it'll be a nice comprehensive listing, and then also links to the previous session. So if you're joining us today and you didn't come to session 1 or session 2, you can also go back and watch those videos. We'll provide those links. We're excited to get started with you today, and I'd like to introduce our panel. I'd like to welcome back Neil Hendrickson, PhD. He is the president of NJ Shade Tree Federation. Neil is an industry expert with over 30 years of experience as a practicing arborist. He obtained his master's in forest science from the University of New Hampshire and his PhD in silviculture and forestry from Yale University. While Neil is now retired from the Bartlett Tree Research Laboratory, He certainly remains a full schedule with his volunteer efforts in his local community and speaking engagements around the state and the country. He participates in conferences as well. I know he'll be busy this weekend with a tree giveaway in our municipality, so he certainly keeps himself very busy and is a dedicated volunteer. I've mentioned in previous sessions, I have the privilege of working closely with Neil in my municipality on all things trees. I've really learned a lot from him, and his passion is really contagious. He is a certified arborist, an NJ certified tree expert, and a member of the Society of American Foresters. Next, happy to welcome back Richard Wolowitz from the NJ Shade Tree Federation. He's their executive director. He's been doing that for about the past 3 years, but has been a member of the Federation for 38 years. Rich is an NJ licensed and certified tree expert. He's ISA certified arborist and a utility specialist. He is the founder of Richview Consulting and has an arboricultural career that spans over 40 years. His career encompasses extensive municipal and utility experiences, and he is a graduate of Cook College at Rutgers University. Next, I'm listed up here. I gave some brief information about my work previously with NJAPZA. I'm their executive director, and my role in Reddington as their land use director and zoning official. But I started my career in the pharmaceutical industry. I graduated from Rutgers University with a degree in biology. Then I primarily worked in the clinical trial management space for a global research organization before transitioning to municipal government, where I went on to obtain the board secretary certification and the zoning official certification from the Rutgers Center of Government Services. I'm passionate about NJAPZA's mission and enjoy assisting other land use professionals in advancing their careers and gaining knowledge through these educational opportunities and networking with colleagues. Lastly, I'd like to welcome Renee Apuzzo to the panel. Renee is a zoning official for Chester Township in Morris County. She's been involved in municipal government for over 9 years, holding a position as a tree conservation officer, a rental housing inspector, code enforcement officer, and as a zoning enforcement official. Renee also served in the United States Army as a motor transporter operator prior to her involvement in municipal government. She graduated from Kaplan University with a BA in Human Services, where she emphasized work in criminal justice, and holds a Master's of Human Services as well. She is a certified Planning and Zoning Board Administrator and a certified zoning official with the Rutgers Center for Government Services. Renee is a seasoned zoning official, and I'm excited for her to be on today to share her experiences with us. So let's get started for today. This is an outline of what we plan to cover in our session 3. We're going to do a very brief recap of session 1 and 2. As I mentioned, you can go back and review those session videos if needed, and just give a basic understanding to work you into session 3. We're going to do an overview of general ordinance structure and how that relates to the sections we're going to focus on in session 3 today. The rest of the session is going to focus on implementing a municipal permit process, and that will include developing an application form, collecting your payments in lieu of planting, assigning an enforcement agent at your municipality to enforce the rules that you've come up with, formulating an inspection process, setting violations and penalties for work done without permit or that doesn't align with your approval, handling unpermitted work and removals, and including an appeal process in your ordinance. So as we go through these, we'll talk about how you may not have all of these elements in your requirements, but we're going to try to do a comprehensive view of the things that you may want to include. So session 1 recap. Our session 1 heavily focused on the NJDEP's tree removal and replacement ordinance requirements. We had a representative from the NJDEP on with us for that session. So if you've missed that, feel free to go back. It was very informative. And they covered what this requirement is. It's a requirement for all municipalities to adopt and enforce a tree removal and replacement ordinance. They have a deadline set of May 1st, 2024 for this, and it's going to apply to all municipalities. It is, they have reassigned all the Tier B municipalities to Tier A, so it's going to apply to all now. This also just covers some of the basic ordinance requirements that we covered in that session. So the DEP did release a model ordinance, but unlike some other model ordinances we might be familiar with that come down to the municipalities, this is not required to be adopted as is. This was a template. This was given to assist municipalities and to tailor it to their individual needs. It can be adopted in whole or in part by a municipality, and you can make modifications as long as you're still addressing both tree removal and replacement, and that it applies to all public and private lands within your municipality's jurisdiction. So there'll be links to the model ordinance if you haven't attended the previous sessions in the post-session recap, so you can check that out, but we'll also talk about some of the sections here today. All right, session 2. So in session 2, we are coming off session 1 of what are the requirements from the NJDEP with the model ordinance, and what customizations are you able to make to tailor this to your community so it's appropriate for the characteristics of your municipality. That's not going to be the same in a rural community as a more urban area. So we talked very extensively about what those differences might be and setting appropriate standards for your area. We also talked about ordinance structure there. So we reviewed the sections of the model ordinance from the NJDEP, highlighted areas that you might want to customize, some that were not required to be included, but might be best practice. But what we're going to focus on here today, we went through the whole thing last time, from your purpose, your definitions, all the way to a servability statement at the end. Today, we're going to be focusing on the regulations. We're going to be focusing on those items in the ordinance that are your teeth of your ordinance, that's what's enforceable. So you're setting all these regulations. How are you going to ensure that that is being followed at your municipality? So again, here, what are you regulating? With this ordinance, we're regulating removal of trees of a certain size. And then how are those going to be replaced? Is that going to be on site? You're going to set that in your schedules that are specific to your municipality, what is required based on the removal. Even what removal requires a permit. That's all something that you're going to be able to customize at your municipality. We also discussed, and will today, your trees, you may not be replanting on site. You may choose to pay those fees into a tree escrow fund or some other fund dedicated at your municipality in lieu of planting. So how are you going to track those? Make sure people are paying that. Or if they're replanting, how are we checking that they're doing that required replanting? So this slide shows the sections of the NJDEP model ordinance. So all the sections they've included in their model ordinance template. And we can't say this enough, that your municipality, many of the people on this call already have a working tree ordinance or well on their way to having something in place, some for many years. You may have less sections, many more sections, as I've seen, depending on how you break it up. Some sections might be broad. I've even seen certain sections where there's a line or two, just how long is your permit lasting for? So your ordinance is not going to have to follow this specifically, but it's probably going to include some of the similar information. So today in session 3, we're focusing on the regulated activity, that's the tree removal and the replacement, your enforcement efforts around those activities, and then setting proper violations, penalties, and how that process is going to work. All right, so now we are into the specific session 3 items. This is implementing a permit process at your municipality. So in the NJDEP model ordinance, for those of you that were with us in session 2, it was highlighted that this is an optional element to the ordinance. They don't require that you have a permit process, but as you'll hear from our panel today, most municipalities will opt to have a permit process so you're able to properly track the applications, review them, make sure the replanting or the payments are being done. And there's going to be a lot of checkpoints along the way. So while you're deciding, what to do with your process, there's some items to consider. That will be an application process. That's going to extend to not just a form, but the administrative duties associated with that. It could be also the form you're going to develop, the fees that are going to be associated with the application, the tracking of that, inspections and verifications, your replacement alternatives. They're not going to replant on site. Your enforcement, and that's going to include the process for enforcement, but also assigning an enforcement agent. Your violations and penalties for not following the rules that are set by ordinance at your municipality, and then an appeal process. So anytime you're issuing a permit or a decision, it's important to have a process for residents or applicants to follow if they don't agree with your decision. So we will go into detail on the items highlighted here, more specifically, one by one. So application process staffing. Now, this is an overview where you want to identify all parties that need to be involved in your municipality's tree removal and replacement ordinance. I think we've learned in Reddington, and we're going to hear from Renee as well about this, that there's going to be a lot of different departments that might be involved in this ordinance beyond what you might be thinking right off the bat, that it's okay, we have to set an enforcement agent, who's going to do these inspections? Well, you might have your Department of Public Works. You're going to be setting up a tree escrow account for people who don't want to replant. You're going to have to involve your finance office and let them know about that. Your advisory boards and commissions. So we have, Neil on the call. He's part of our environmental commission in Reddington. So you might have advisory boards or a shade tree commission that's going to be involved in this process. Consultants. So if you need to bring somebody on board that's an expert to do inspections and things like that, and Rich is going to speak to some of that throughout the different aspects of the process. You might not have someone in-house. You might need to bring someone in that's an expert. And even if you do, might be cases where there's a large-scale removal where your municipality may need to hire an expert, things like that. And then even other departments that we haven't highlighted here that are specific to your municipality that are going to be involved in this process. And Renee, when you've worked with other municipalities in setting this up, do you feel that doing those conversations ahead of time and really identifying everyone and how this is going to work, and that help you set your process?
So in Bernardsville, where I was located, where they had the tree ordinance, the way that we worked it was we had an administrative assistant that took in the permit so that there was a tracking and there was monies that were taken in for the application fee at that time. And then it was provided to myself, the tree conservation officer, as per their ordinance, is to perform the inspections and enforcement. So at that point, that's where I would be able to do the review of the application at that time, go out to the property to perform the inspection. And in this case, there were other individuals that got involved if I needed. For example, we did have a forester that sat on the shade tree committee. That individual did assist me in species identification and or any further questions that I really had, as I did not hold those types of certifications as an arborist or a forester, wasn't a planner. So, I at the time was their zoning enforcement officer that also became their tree conservation officer. So I had a lot of help from the volunteer, the forester, should I had questions come to species, DBH, which is your diameter breast height, which is how you measure the tree. So we would definitely consult him if I needed that assistance.
Yeah, and I mean, you've identified so many other players that will be involved in this process. I skipped the administration slide here because we kind of started touching on that. But to go back, think about all the things you're going to include in your process and who you would need to identify. As we go through this, it's going to be highlighted over and over that you're going to make improvements as you go along. So as you start something, you might say, oh, we really should have involved, DPW when it's street trees or in municipal right-of-ways, things like that. And you're going to make those corrections and you're going to update your ordinance and bring in other departments. But take a step back, look at how you're going to plan this out and try to bring everyone on board in the beginning, bring all stakeholders together. So there's some uniform consensus of everyone understanding how this works and what their role is going to be in it. Again, Renee was able to call on a volunteer to help her out. But check in your municipality. Is that going to be an option for you? Are you going to have a consultant that's going to play into probably your fee schedule and things like that? These are things to identify early on. So the application process and administration of that. Things to consider here, are you going to have a dedicated tree removal application form? Now we're going to get into this a bit later with towns that do and that don't. In Reddington, we use a zoning permit form and they list the application type as tree removal. What information are you going to acquire at the time of application? I've seen the gamut from a very basic form to a very detailed form. Where is your municipality going to fall on what information you're going to require from your applicants? Being mindful that a lot of your applicants are residents, that they're not going to be filling things out like this every day. They're not developers and things like that. So you might have some challenges depending on the information you're going to be asking for there. What fees are you going to collect? We'll talk about fee schedules in a few different towns as we go along. Some have an application fee and some also have an inspection fee that's above the application one. How will you track all of this? So there's a lot of things to track in this process. The applications that come in, the permits that you issue, and then the compliance that's going to go along with those permits, like the replanting requirements or paying into the fund. How are you going to track that those actions are being done? And we're going to talk about how that's being done at a few different municipalities. So application tracking process. Just highlighting all the kinds of things you're going to need to track here. You have to think down the line, and especially this differs if for those on the call that review like our zoning officials and people in construction offices where we issue a shed permit. Well, if it's small enough, put it up. We're not going to come out and inspect, or there's an inspection shortly after the work is done. With a tree application, there might be several months until they can properly do the replanting or when they're going to action the removal. So you don't want to lose track of that process, or say they come back and they can't do the replanting and they want to pay into the fund. You want to make sure that you're tracking this throughout the process. And I'm going to go back to Renee in a moment here, because they had a great way of tracking this in her municipality in a previous role. In Reddington, we use spatial data logic, and some towns I know you guys use other municipal softwares like Mitchell Humphreys or maybe GovPilot, where they may have something already, and this is something to look into, where you can track your tree permits and issue them and things like that. But as Renee's going to speak to, you don't need to have a software in place. In her previous municipality, they used Excel and it worked quite well for them. Would you kind of walk us through how you did that, Renee?
Sure. So we did use Excel. Every single tree permit that came into the office was provided a application number, which started with the year in which you were in, and simply did a dash. If it was number 1 for that year, then you put number 1, so that it was seamless to keep track of how many you had for that year. You would go in that sequence. We would put it into the Excel with the information of the site itself, where it was located, block and lot, your typical kind of zoning information that you would typically be reporting or have on your zoning application. This would just further with the contractor's name with their license number that they have with the state. Further, if there were conditions to be made, such as they had replacements and or they decided they wanted to do replacements and pay into the tree trust fund because they could not satisfy, say it was 10 trees they had to replace, they had to put on site. By ordinance in Bernardsville, you were permitted to pay into the tree trust fund at 75%, and then you would have to plant 25% on site. So, you did have to keep track of that. So the Excel sheet provided us, we could tailor it to have them be yellow, the ones that had replacements and or some type of payment into the tree trust fund. This would allow us to then a year later, once there was follow-up with enforcement, we could send them a letter, first stating that, hey, we need to verify that you've put in these plantings. We didn't get a check regarding the tree trust fund that you owed monies to the tree trust fund. So that would allow us to then a year later keep track of who did not, comply with those conditions. So we'd send out that letter first. If they did not respond, a notice of violation could go out at that time. So it was probably the most efficient way we could keep track from beginning to end with compliance.
Yeah, that seems like a very comprehensive thing. You're able to track a lot of different aspects of the permit process. We're going to get into a lot of the stuff Renee touched on with enforcement, doing the inspections. Neil and Rich are going to speak to that as well later on in the session, but all in one place. And I'm sure that could be a shared document. So seeing what you're going to track at your municipality and what the best way for you to accomplish that would be. Is finance going to need to see your sheet? How are you going to share this between departments? These are all things to try to think about up front, but of course, with everything, making the necessary adjustments as you go along to perfect your process. We've had a process in place for several years now in Redington, but we have a running list of things we want to update and improve upon and make better. Just like with other ordinances, this one is getting long, so I'm sure we'll be changing or updating the ordinance soon to incorporate a lot of these changes. All right, so now we're going to move into developing an application form and what those requirements might be. So we're going to first talk about the ordinance requirements and how that might differ in different municipalities. So here we have up the ordinance section from the Bernardsville Code. And so these are from the ordinance. So even though we're talking about an application form that you're going to get, it says here from the tree conservation officer in the township, I'm sure it's also on the website, the requirements of what's going to be on that form are listed in the ordinance. And Renee, if you would just walk us through some of the things you're asking for here, and I'll pull up the form next that you guys have.
Sure. So it's very similar to a zoning application. With that said, you'll give it a permit number and or application number. You should have the fees mentioned on there as to what you're collecting. So in this case, with Bernardsville, the fee for the application was $25. But if it was a demolishing of a dwelling, there were additional fees. If it was a vacant piece of property, it was additional fees. So it was important for you as the conservation officer to ensure that the fee that was collected was correct. So you would further go down, make sure you had good contact information, where the site is located, contractor's name, license numbers, all of their contact information, the approximate start date. So at least you knew when they were going to be starting this work. And then, with the Bernardsville form, we provided an area where they could draw a sketch for those that were taking down some simple trees, 1, 2, maybe 3 trees, where if it was more of a developer, that would be a full-blown site plan. So that would be an additional document that would be submitted with this particular application. On the second page, you see there, they would list how many of a certain species, the diameter breast height, the condition of the tree, and the reason for the removal. This was especially important. This was a modified section of this application when I became part of the process. We found that this actually was what contractors like to be able to see. So we did modify it on behalf of a contractor that was a regular applicant. He seemed to, he gave us this idea. So we did put it as part of the application, and it does seem to work and flow a little easier as you're filling it out as the applicant. So with that said, you then had our bottom portion to where the signature of the official signing off and any type of replacements that were required would be part of that addition to the bottom of the application as your review.
Thank you. And we talked about fees, and that will be in a separate section here. A lot of municipalities will pull that out into a separate section. Your form requirements will be one part, and the fees will be in another, but you can, structure it however you'd like. Very similar ordinance type section from the Reddington Code, where these are included in the ordinance of what we're going to ask you for on the application form. It's important to note that. So when you're asking for something and you're getting pushback, I know my municipal officials on the call will be happy when something is included in the ordinance that you need to be asking for. So when they're saying, and I'm not going to give you that, well, it's an ordinance requirement. I'm entitled to ask for this, and I need to have this to review your permit. So anything you're going to be asking for on the application, you do want to make sure to include in your ordinance, so there's documented, reason of why you're going to be needing that. Unlike Bernardsville, and just it goes on to the second page here with some requirements, we do not have a dedicated tree removal form. That is something we're looking to implement. Right now, it is the fees and the form is aligned with a zoning permit. And like Renee said, we're collecting a lot of the same information, and we just simply ask for this additional information in this ordinance section. So fill out the zoning application and give us the additional information that's required in this section of the ordinance to do the removal. But when everything is not, laid out right in your face, there's a lot of back and forth with trying to get all the information. So we will move to a dedicated tree removal form. It also notes here that we have a section specifically laying out what should be included on a sketch. So you can also note that in your ordinance. Are you going to require a survey? Are you going to accept a sketch that shows where these trees are on the property? That might be appropriate for municipalities that have smaller lots, or where the lots generally only have a few trees. It would be easy to see on site. Sometimes even a Google Earth image might be better, so they can circle the trees. I think you're going to look at your inspection process to see what's going to work best for your municipality with what you're going to accept. And then also add some element of flexibility based on the situation. Right, here we've also included the Jackson Township application form. We're looking at this in Reddington because it encompasses a lot of steps in the process into one form, where it shows the application information you need to review it. There's a section to show that the fees are collected, and a note that they've been paid, what the decision is going to be, the approval, denial, or if it's conditional, or there are trees that need to be planted, things like that. And then it's signed off on by their tree specialist. The second page has a place to do a sketch. So it shows where the house is, and you can come up with a sketch here if maybe you don't have a survey, something like that. So there's different options to accommodate this. That's what we're trying to demonstrate here. The spreadsheet that Renee was talking about seems to include a lot of this information that's on the one form here. So it's really your preference, what's going to work best for your workflow in your municipality, but just be cognizant of all these elements you're going to need to track along the way as you go. All right, this is about fees. So your application process. So I want to highlight right off the bat, these are not the replacement fees, like for in lieu of replanting those fees. These are your administrative fees that you may or may not decide to charge for your application. There's nothing to say your municipality has to charge an application fee. Many will. And if you do, you need to include that in a fee section in your ordinance. So here is a chart from the NJDEP model ordinance that has a fee schedule, an application fee schedule in the end. as was noted in session 2, a lot of municipalities are using that last column in the chart for your replacement fees that you might need to do in lieu of planting, and setting like a standard application fee regardless of how many trees to be removed. So the application fee remains the same, but they're capturing the replanting fees in the chart. But again, there's flexibility on how you want to do it. Some municipalities, as we'll see in the next slide here, will set separate fees. So they may have an application fee or an application fee and an inspection fee. You may have even multiple inspection fees if there's time frames that you want to inspect removal. So here I've highlighted in Reddington, we have a flat fee and it aligns with our zoning permit application fee. So it's a $35 fee. And we do not have a separate additional inspection fee. So that works for us right now. As we have Neil, who's on the panel, he is a volunteer for the township and does our inspections. So we don't have to incorporate or account for any additional cost for that right now. And we'll get into the tree escrow fund and what that can be used for later on for the townships that will need to bring in a consultant. In Bernardsville, will you talk about that, Renee, how your fee schedule was structured?
So the fee schedule was structured just to implement the application fee at $25. If it was a vacant property or some type of redevelopment of a property where there was a dwelling that was demolished, it would be $100 per acre in addition, and that is still collected as an application fee.
Thank you. And then we have at the end here a different structure, where in Jackson there's an application fee of $10, but there's also a separate application or inspection fee. So we saw that on the form. They're collecting 2 checks, likely because they're going to different accounts at the time of application. So there's a lot of flexibility with how you can set this up. It has to, align with how your process is going to work in your municipality, and just be clear in your ordinance of what your fees are, and also on your forms or your website. So when the public come in, they have, the check or the payment, and they can not have to come back or make it a difficult process for them. I know, Rich, with your work in municipalities as a consultant, you've seen a variety of fee schedules, and some being quite large even at the application stage.
That's correct, Christine. I've seen one town charges $100 per tree removal as part of their application process, and that's the only fee they go for. Other towns go for $25 per tree. If it's a dead tree, they waive the fee. So, there's a lot of flexibility.
Yeah, so just figure out how you want your process to work and set those accordingly. All right. So now we're talking about different fees. These are the fees in lieu of planting. So this is how I've seen most municipalities set up their charts. But again, you can have a lot of flexibility in how you're going to do that. We had a lot of different examples from municipalities that we included in session 2, where the removal of the DBH, the trees you need to replant, and the fees are all very clearly laid out in a chart. That seems to work nicely. This is even something you could include in your application form if that's easy for, not to say, oh, go look at the ordinance. It could maybe be on a cover sheet or something like that. So people filling it out have all the information right there. That may be a good idea. But just wanted to highlight that these fees are different when you're reviewing the application of the scope of work. So, okay, they're going to be taking down 2 trees. They don't want to replant. You can calculate the cost. Or they're going to be, if they are going to be replanting on site, you're going to note that you're not collecting the fees. But these are not the application fees. These are the fees they're paying because they're not going to be replanting. So that's a separate fee, aside from any application fee you're going to collect. All right. And again, that has to be your replacement alternatives. That's the section in the model ordinance, and in many municipal ordinances, you're going to see that. You're going to have to lay that out in your ordinance. So you can have these rules, but you're going to have to put them into your municipal ordinance. So in Reddington, we call it a tree escrow fund. The ordinance establishes the fund and how it's going to be used. It also talks about here how we can, pay any consultants needed out of this fee or this fund. So luckily now we don't need to dip into this very much because, Neil assists us on a volunteer basis. But there's going to be municipalities that are going to have to bring in a consultant from time to time for removals, or they might be a very regular fixture in your process. So that's something you're going to have to think through and identify, who is going to be your team on this and, what fees you might be incurring.
Christina, a quick comment, just
Sure.
because I've seen it come up in Q&A. Your screen shows presenter view. Can you put it on so your slide takes up the whole screen?
Oh,
If you can't, it's the best we can do, but I've seen a number of comments just asking you to switch your view so they can see the text better and the slide better. Sorry about that. Sorry to interrupt.
No, I was not keeping track of that. And let's see. That's the same thing.
That's much better.
Is it?
Yeah, that should do it. I'll look at the Q&A and chat to see if anybody complains, but you just blew it up about double, so that's terrific.
Well, it's still not the. Let me
No,
see if
go
I can
with that.
change the
It's good.
view.
That's good. Go with that.
Well, I apologize, everyone. I'm not sure. I've got a few screens going here, and I'm not sure where I can change this.
You've got it, Christina. They're seeing full screen now.
Okay, thank you, Emily. Apologize for that, everyone. As we mentioned, you will be getting a copy of the slide. So if something was too small to see, I really do apologize for that, but you will be getting a copy so you can go back and reference anything that was too small to see there. All right. So next we're going to go into assigning an enforcement agent for your ordinance. So starting off here, I've included the section from the NJDEP's model ordinance. That would be section 5 of the template that they provided. And this is where you're going to set who is responsible for enforcing these rules. So in the model, it says this ordinance shall be enforced by it gives the options, police department, municipal officials, or other during the course of ordinary enforcement duties. So you can change that to align with your other enforcement sections. I know ours very closely follows some of the land use enforcement sections that I use in zoning. But what we want to highlight here is that the responsibilities will vary based on municipality of what the enforcement agent needs to do, and that this enforcing agent can differ from the party conducting the tree inspections or even reviewing or approving the applications. So in some municipalities, you're going to be it from a soup to nuts, from start to finish. You might do all of the things. In other municipalities, you may have an administrative staff that enters the applications in. Another party that's going to go out and do your inspection. And then the zoning officer or somebody else may be brought on just in case there's issues. You're the enforcing person if the inspection notes that there's issues or work commenced without approval, because you have those enforcement powers. So that's going to be noted in your ordinance. But just to highlight, that's going to change from township to township. And we put some examples in the bottom here. In Reddington, that's the zoning officer is noted as the enforcement agent. Now, I'm involved in the administrative portion when the applications come in, working with the residents. Then I hand it off to Neil and our DPW director in Reddington Township, who is also an arborist, to do the inspections on site. I'm not involved in that part of it, but if they give me a call, and usually it's early in the morning on a Monday, that that we've got complaints or we've noticed that all this tree removal has happened, that's when I have to get involved as the enforcing agent. So I can still work with them on, and we'll get into that later, of inspecting work after it's commenced. But that's when I will get involved because I have power to write violations, to take things to court. In Burnsville, will you speak how that works with your enforcing agent role when you were there, Renee?
Sure. So I wore a couple hats at that time. So I was the zoning enforcement officer while being the tree conservation officer. So the way that they had it in their ordinance is that either or could enforce any type of compliance that needed to be met at that time. So it could be as simple as, reaching out, going out to the property itself while the incident is happening, where you can stop the work and have them fill out the application, submit it at that time, and they may commence once the permit was approved by the tree conservation officer. Or, we had to do a notice of violation because the work was already done. It was done over the weekend. We saw the, stumps or, wood chips, any type of evidence that we could possibly come up with, complaints from neighbors. So that would then trigger the notice of violation to be sent out to the homeowner.
Thank you. I know, Rich, you work in several municipalities, and we were talking prior to this session, in some, you also have some enforcement capabilities?
That's right. In one town, basically, that's the way the ordinance was written up, that the consulting forester, or known as the town arborist, has the authority to enforce and send a notice of violation. In other towns, they take the information, document it, and then send it up to administration for their follow-up. So again, it's a lot how the town sets up their system. It's like not one style. It's not a cookie cutter. Everything goes by what the town wants to do.
Absolutely. And when Renee and I were getting ready for this section, we had highlighted where it's important to have this noted in the ordinance, where initially, in Burnsville, when they first had an issue, in her role as the zoning officer, saying, you'll need to be the enforcing agent. But if you're not noted in the ordinance to be doing so, that could be a problem if you had to that could be challenged. So you want to make sure somebody is specifically called out. You likely have language like this in other sections of your ordinance. You just want to make sure it's also included in your tree removal and replacement ordinance. The last example we have here is for Jackson Township. It says that the code enforcement officer can get involved, and it's going to be referred to them by the tree specialist or the shade tree commission for enforcement actions. It also appears that the tree specialist is authorized to issue violations and sign complaints, as Rich was just speaking to. So it's however you set it up. You just want to make sure you note it in your ordinance how you're going to have it work. All right, so moving on to formulating an inspection process. So we wanted to skip ahead to kind of talk about who's going to be your enforcing agent on this stuff, but highlighting there that they might not be the same person that's going out and doing inspections. So in Reddington, that is Neil, and we'll speak to that a bit in a moment. For Renee, when she was in Burnsville, that was her. She was the tree conservation officer. So it's however you set that up. And then you'll see here on the images we've included, there's trees with them marked with a ribbon. Those are likely slated for removal and need inspection. And then there's a survey where somebody's noted in red the trees for removal, and in blue the trees that they're going to be replanting. So I'd like to hand this over to Neil and to Rich to kind of talk about, what are some best practices that you've observed with conducting these inspections? You may not be the one dealing with the homeowners when they come in and explaining the scope of work and we're doing this, these are where the trees are. What are you seeing that's going to be helpful, first on the administrative side, when you get handed something and saying, hey, go out and look at this?
I'll turn this over to you, Rich, in a moment, but I can, if you can go back to that map just to give you give us a sense. I have gone out to a property and got the trees all properly marked, and then it's a case of trust but verify. So they changed their plans, or evidently did, and changed the tags on the trees after I left. So there is always that possibility of having to make multiple verifications to go back. It's just, it is, you want to trust them, but you do need to verify. And Rich, I'll leave that, turn that to you.
Yes, one of the things that I really push is that the map comes in handy. However, physically marking the trees is vital, because if the application process says, I'm going to take down 6 maples, and there aren't 6 maples out there because it was misidentified, and it's understandable. People don't know exactly what the species is a species, but it's easier to make a double visit if need be. If it wasn't marked, you can't approve the permit. It's easier to check it after the fact than having to glue the tree back together. It doesn't work that way. So it has to be in a process that you can identify it. Also, looking at this picture, it's important to everybody realizes that what constitutes a tree. What in your ordinance says, is it 6 inches and above or 12 inches above is another town I have. When you have some of the stragglers, it's like real tough.
Yeah, and along those lines, there was a case that I mentioned in a previous session where I went to look at a tree, and the homeowner had called Christina and said, the tree company wants to come and take down all the trees because they're all ash trees. There was one ash tree and 20 plus beautiful red oak trees. So it was just a tree company trying to make some money. So that is why multiple verifications, visits, and a good map. They hadn't marked those trees when I looked at them. So what Rich is saying, I endorse entirely. Anything that is being done should be clearly marked.
Yeah, and I know in our municipality, a lot of the removals are for ash trees. And we find that since we think those are going to be exempt generally, we still just ask that the residents apply, but we don't charge them a fee to at least verify that. And from inspection, we have noticed that they're not all ash, as noted a lot of the time. And if they want to still remove those, if they're not going to be exempt for any of the exemptions we have listed in our ordinance, that Neil will let me know what they are, and I'll get back to them saying, okay, well, yes, these ones were ash, but these other ones will require replacement. Point them to our chart that shows what the replanting will be or the fee, and they'll decide how they want to proceed. So that's why that on-site inspection is very important. So here we've noted again that the person doing the inspections can often differ from the enforcing agent, from the person doing the administrative work around your process. And there's different things you're going to want to consider. Are you going to always inspect the work prior to authorizing removals? There's some that come in where they're saying, I'm taking down 2 trees. They simply pay the fee or know what the replacement's going to be. Is that enough in that case? They're not trying to say any are exempt. They're simply telling you what the DBH is and what they're going to be doing for the restitution following the ordinance. Your municipality may not require a site inspection, but you might. Are you going to confirm the replacement trees? So once the replanting is in, is there going to be another site inspection to show that? I would think you're going to need some way to verify that it's been done, but I understand from talking to many municipal officials across the state, you know, everyone is spread thin and has a lot of roles. So how are you going to accommodate that? I know sometimes we rely on the construction office where I put a condition on a permit. So if it's for a pool or an accessory building, they have a note in there that there's replanting that needs to be done. Once that's in, they'll let me know that, give me the heads up that, hey, we're ready to issue the CA on this work. It's coming to completion. You want to go out and check the trees. So at least we have a checkpoint on that. You know, I know Renee was talking about their spreadsheet that they have intervals they follow up on. This is a way we do it for work and improvements that require tree removal. So thinking about all those things, maybe there's other departments that can loop in to kind of help you with that. Maybe engineering as well, if they have checkpoints, if they're going to be on site. So trying to get creative sometimes of looping other people in to help you. But you are going to want to note that that replanting was in fact done. And then also there's maybe inspections during construction. And we're going to talk about this later in the session of proper tree protection and things like that. But like Neil said, sometimes they go as far as maybe switching them, but we've also seen where we go out, there's maybe a few trees. I say we, but I mean Neil goes out, there's a few trees noted for removal, but then they clear all the ones around it, and it is beyond the scope of what was approved or permitted. So you may want to consider some checkpoints during the construction process, especially if it's a large project. Here we're noting who can do the inspections. Again, these are noted by or included in ordinance. So in Reddington Township, it says Environmental Commission or designee. In Bernardsville, it says Tree Conservation Officer or the Shade Tree Committee, and I can have I speak to that a bit in her involvement as a tree conservation officer when she was there.
Thanks, Christina. So when it comes to the inspection process, the way that, you know, we handled it at the time in Bernardsville was, you know, I had the administrative assistant provide me with the application. The monies were already taken care of. The permit number was already provided. So all of that information was already provided to me. That way, once I was doing my review and reached out to the landowner and or the contractor at the time, you know, I could go out to the site. I have all of my information. I have a package of that application with the survey typically indicating where those trees were being removed. In addition to, they did have to be tagged. And again, you know, referring to your ordinance and making sure that your ordinance has this language in it, just further helps, you know, guide you in educating the contractor and the landowner of, you know, hey, these are the items that I do need in order to fulfill the inspection process, in order to sign off on this permit. So again, you know, once you get out there, you perform your inspection. Most times I was okay doing it myself as being a tree conservation officer and the zoning official. You know, sometimes I would have to call on our forester who sat on the shade tree committee for more support, especially with certain species, invasive species. So there was that level of, you know, I was able to call him on the cell phone or even text him or show him a picture. So it became, you know, very flexible to be able to make that communication with him for those odd questions that I may have. If there were an obligation to fulfill replacements with Bernardsville, it was a maximum 75% that could be paid into the tree trust fund, where 25% of those replacement trees that were obligated to plant was 25%. So for me, there was a lot of education that had to be provided to, especially, you know, just a landowner just trying to take out trees. Maybe they were taking out an old buffer living fence, you know, where the trees were in perfect condition. They had no, you know, they were not a hazard of any kind. They just really wanted to change the living fence to a different species. So that sort of thing would require replacements. So with that said, you know, there were some calculations that I had to do in order to satisfy, hey, did you want to pay 75% into the tree trust fund, or did you want to plant the 25%? Sometimes there was a bit of back and forth to figure out that number. Sometimes it became 50-50%, but in this case, this is the way that the Bernardsville ordinance was written. So it did involve a little bit more of that communication, more than just in the beginning and, you know, here you go, here's your permit. So I think it is important to make sure that, you know, you are in fact enforcing your ordinance and finding whatever easier path you can to educate the applicant, because at the end of the day, that is part of our job, is to educate them, but also ensure that they are complying.
Yeah, I think you raised a really good point there on education. I know, Neil, you can probably speak to that when you go on site and meet with these homeowners, a lot of what you're doing is kind of guiding them on some maybe responsible removal, or what their plan often changes after they meet with Neil
Yeah.
on site. They may have a very
No,
robust plan,
for
and
sure.
he's
You
able
know,
to advise them.
it's an old story. Most people, when they go to the physician, don't say, I have a pain in my arm, please remove it. But most homeowners think that arboriculture is just taking down trees or cutting off parts. It's a lot more than that. And so that's why a professional who can be trusted, who has some credentials, although that's not always assurance that they'll be very competent. But you're closer if you get like a licensed tree expert, which comes up later in the presentation. Um, but yes, in most cases, when I spend the time walking the property with a homeowner, and I think somebody put in a Q&A or came up elsewhere, is it a good idea to meet the homeowner sometimes? Because they need the education, because they just don't know anything about trees. They think they do, and a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. So as far as that goes, yes, in more cases than not, when Christina has asked me to visit a property and I meet with the homeowner, they didn't know, and when they get the information, they make better decisions when they're better informed. That's simple.
Thanks. And to this slide and how it differs from municipality to municipality, I know, Rich, you've had a wide variety across the spectrum of your, involvement in this process in different municipalities. Sometimes it's very limited to inspections, and in others you have a greater span of roles.
That's right. One of the, it depends what the town wants. That setup. I've been, and I'm aware of some situations where inspect the permit, expect the tree, deny the permit of the tree, there's nothing wrong with it, or just go along with the removal. And then follow up afterwards, and then running a spreadsheet, almost like Renee has, in terms of what was the planting, replanting requirement, and the property is re-inspected within a year or so. So basically, it varies the whole gamut from a very minor activity to a more of a diligent, thorough inspection process with multiple visits.
Yeah. So takeaway here is there's a lot of different ways to address this. You just want to think through that and determine how your municipality is going to handle that. And make sure you have good communication. I think that was also highlighted if the same person is not involved in these different steps in the process. There's a lot of communication that needs to happen. Even just the administrative staff with the homeowner, sometimes back and forth. And then the person conducting the inspections back to anyone in the municipality that might be issuing these permits, communicating to the homeowner, what was observed on site. So you want to establish, how you're going to communicate. Are you going to get a written report following inspection, what's going to be the requirement at your municipality. So, and Neil had talked about this briefly of proper justification. So this is a section from the NJDEP model ordinance. Yeah, it was included in the exemption section, and it kind of outlines something you might want to include in your ordinance of what your municipality is going to accept as proper justification. So they're saying a tree is either exempt, or in this case it's exempt, but even in the cases where they want to take it down and they're telling you why, what is reasonable and maybe suggested for municipality to accept here. Neil, would you talk to that a bit?
Yeah, it's again what I had said about trust but verify. We just want to know. We believe them. We just want to see proof of what's going on for what I just said. For example, the red oaks that were called ashes. Rich, what do you do in a case like this?
Yeah, the field verification is vital. Again, like you said, Neil, it's not necessarily you don't want to prove them, but you don't want to believe them. However, going out there, seeing it for yourself, it paints a better picture in your head what's going on, and be able to talk and explain a point of conversation and go from there.
Yeah, and it has come up in Q&A. I've been trying to respond to some of those. If someone wants to take down a calorie pear or Russian olives, our township is overrun. We're perfectly happy. The point that Christina has impressed on me in the years I have been volunteering for this is be flexible, be reasonable. In court, there's the test of always, is it reasonable? And when we go out and look at properties, is it reasonable? A recent case, there was somebody who was in a nice location, reopening a very popular cafe and wanted to put in outdoor dining. And in the way was a mulberry, a relatively large one, in pretty bad condition. So Christina gave me the authority to say, no, that's okay. Will you be replanting? Yeah, we're going to landscape extensively. And again, you use your discretion and to decide, is this acceptable? And in that case, I said it was. And I had said this in one of our earlier sessions. What Reddington would love to do was have a no net loss. That's an easy place to start. Are you taking down more trees than you want to? And if so, what do you want to do about it? So in the case here, we try to get the justification. And again, the issue of justification is most people just don't know much about trees. And so you want someone who does to provide guidance. Oh, yeah. And there you go. So the highest standard, we think, and I sit on the board of the New Jersey chapter of the International Society of Arboriculture and the board of the Shade Tree Federation. And we think that the New Jersey LTE is the most rigorous credential you can get in the United States. You're very likely to get a competent person if you get an LTE. Beyond that, because the subject came up in earlier sessions of what people are calling hazard trees, for professionals in arboriculture, hazard tree is not a term we use. We talk about low risk or high risk. And that came from this credential, TRAC, Tree Risk Assessment Qualification. For people who take that 2-day course, they're looking at other things about the tree, where it's growing, under what circumstances, what risks might it present. Is it in an area where there are a lot of targets like people or houses present, or is it out in a field? These things never came up before. And this track qualification is about 10, 12 years old. If you really want someone, yeah, it's like any credential. You might get a very good person. You might get someone who just tested well. But more than likely, if you look for one of these two qualifications, you're going to get someone who will give you the straight story, the correct story, and a plausible story that you can take to your municipality and to your homeowners.
Thank you, Neil. And we've included this slide in previous sessions. It'll be here as well if you want to check out these qualifications as you determine what proper justification your municipality may accept. So now moving on to setting violations and penalties. So starting with the NJDEP model section on violations and penalties of what they have there. So they've included some sample text. The takeaway from their sample text, which you'll see we've implemented in Reddington, is the violation and penalty needs to incentivize people to get permits. So it cannot be equal to or less than what they would have paid if they decide not to replant and paid into your tree escrow fund or whatever you're calling that. So if it's a less fee, people would just commence without permits. You need to make it higher than what they would have paid if they applied for the proper permitting. And again, you can set a schedule, a chart, I mean, whatever you want to do here. Ours is pretty simple in Reddington. I've highlighted the section that I think is important here. So it is a fine punishable to what is included in the chart, plus a 25% surplus. So above and beyond what you would have paid. So if your replacement would have been a $300 charge, we're adding a 25% fee on top of that. And then also I've seen this in a lot of ordinances. Each tree is a separate offense. So I know we have similar language in our zoning ordinance for each day as a separate offense that something occurs. In this case, each tree is a separate offense. And I have had to use that provision to write multiple tickets summonses going to court for a removal that took place on a weekend. We went out after the fact. That was not permitted. There was no exemptions that applied to these trees, and it was multiple trees, so I had to write multiple summons. So I had to reference that provision of the ordinance. Burnsville has something similar. I'll hand over to Renee to kind of talk about their violation and penalty section.
Christina, so very similar to Reddington, it is per tree is the cost of the penalty. I have had interactions with writing summonses as well at the time of being in Burnsville with these particular instances where it happened over the weekend, and you found out on Monday once you got complaints from neighbors, went out to do the inspection, which is something that I would always encourage, is that you do verifying fact that it has happened. Definitely get as much as pictures as you possibly can so that you do have a robust file for going in front of the court there. With that said, at the time that I had experience in court, there was discovery. The individual did acquire or retain an attorney, so discovery did happen. So with that said, it's always good to have quite a file that does tell the full extent of what is happening, so that when the applicant's attorney does get that information, you're both looking at the same information, and it's very transparent as to what has happened. So that way, when you do get to the end of it, where the fines are finally said and done and set by the judge at that time, there is that continuity of what has happened. So in this case that I had experience with, we made it a condition that the payment would go into the tree trust fund, so that in fact the shade tree could further that monies for the good of the community, where they did later that next year they utilized that money because it was quite a contribution, where they were able to beautify a subdivision that was built in the late 1990s. They were fruit trees in a shade tree easement that was to the front of the street. So they were considered their street trees in that subdivision. So they were able to remove them and have newly fresh trees planted to beautify that neighborhood. So it was a good at the end of it all. So full circle there.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing that, Renee. And you touched on some points that we're gonna get to in a little bit, but to highlight now the importance of your file. So for my municipal officials that do enforcement on the call, I mean, we all are also familiar with the OPR process. You want to have proper documentation along the way, especially with these kinds of things on residential lots. You might have neighbors that are questioning what was done. If somebody appeals your decision, which we're going to talk about later, you want to have a very clear file of what your actions were and showing that they're in line with what your ordinance is. That's why, as a municipal official, I review and an enforcing agent, the new ordinances that are passed, and sometimes have comments back to the governing body or the planning board saying, we need to clarify some of this because it's not, as it's written now, the enforceability is going to be difficult, or it's not as clear as I would like, because I'm the one that's going to be defending the township and our actions based on our ordinance. So, certainly make sure that you're included in that process as a municipal official and as the enforcing agent, and seeing what's in there, and that you think it is going to be sufficient for if you need to take it to court, if you have an appeal. As we talked about, oh, I'm sorry, we've not talked about it yet. We will talk about appeals in a few slides, so I'll talk about that a bit more. But having a comprehensive file, having that paperwork trail is always important at a municipality. Okay,
And,
so
just,
now we talked about this a little bit in the past section with when work happens without a permit. So we all know that this happens. A lot of times you'll hear about on a Monday after everyone's been outside on the weekend and seeing what their neighbors are up to, or if we've had a nice stretch of weather, the complaints are going to come in and you're going to get these calls to inspect work that has commenced on neighboring properties. It's usually a complaint-driven thing, but even your Department of Public Works may call and say, oh, we noticed all these trees as we're out doing our jobs that have been taken down. Even Neil has alerted me to removals that have taken place as he's, going about his business around town. I've seen them on my way into work, and I've alerted everyone once we get in that we've got something to look into now. So Rich and Neil, I'd like to give this to you guys to say, how can we now, the work has taken place, what options do municipalities have to try to come up with, okay, they've done this work, how can we calculate proper fees? How can we determine what was taken down at site? What are some resources that are available and options here?
Well, I'll get to you, Rich, but I will say that one very notable one that I happened to see, a local tree company, which was interesting because the one tree company was registered, but they subcontracted another tree company who was not to do the work. It gets complicated. I look at the site, I contact Christina, who contacts the responsible tree company, and we get a letter back with a diagram saying all the trees were dead, dying, leaning over the house. But that owner, the tree company owner, failed to recognize that there's Google Earth and there's Google Earth Street View, which turns out this house was built in a young, healthy stand of tulip trees, a nice, straight, tall tree. And as anybody who has had this track qualification will tell you, a stand of trees is far more stable than a single tree all by itself, where others have been cleared around it. So so that we had multiple issues, but it was easy to do those things. And then I simply went out to the site. The homeowner agreed because they, as some of the Q&A came up, the homeowner didn't know that there was an ordinance, didn't know that the tree company had to be registered. I happen to notice them among other reasons because among the things that is required by the state is they have personal protective equipment on. These people were unprotected and subjecting themselves to risk on the property, which would have transferred to the homeowner. So there's a lot of reasons to have a registered tree company. But the point is, I went out and measured the stumps. I don't ever know what came out of it, but we had plenty of evidence. And again, you can never take enough pictures of these things if you see them. I sent it to somebody in the Q&A. If you drive by and see a tree company working, take a moment to look at the side of the truck. There should be a registration number on there, and the people should have hard hats and ear protection, eye protection, chaps often as not. And if they don't, it might be well to be suspicious. I said it to somebody else on the Q&A that if you go to the State Board of Tree Experts, New Jersey State Board of Tree Experts, there's a list of every unlicensed and every licensed tree company, every registered tree company on there. I keep that on my desktop. And I check every time I hear a chainsaw. I'm one of those. Every time I hear a chainsaw and drive by a company, I double check, I slow down, I stare at them just to make sure they know somebody is checking. And then if they're not registered, we call the State Board of Tree Experts. They have inspectors, and an inspector will come out and inspect them. And if the company's gone by the time the inspector gets there, the important thing is to take pictures of the truck, of the people, of the job, of the trees that are down. So it's like anything else. If it were to go to court, it's all about the evidence. So if you have clear and undeniable evidence, I sent a report to Christina with pictures from Google Earth, New Jersey Map 2, Parcel Explorer, as Christina has on the slide, and went past and got Christina to get me access to the property and measure the stump. We got them to stop work because they were grinding the stumps so the evidence would be gone. So we could reestablish the trees and their size from that. So it might take a little work, but that was a clear cut. And that was pretty dramatic and right in the middle of a treed neighborhood. So it was simply because the homeowner, to the best of my knowledge, was afraid they're too tall, they could fall on my house. They have been there for 40, 50 years through all kinds of storms, Sandy and everything else. And that didn't give enough evidence that they weren't going to fall. So any tree can fall, but these weren't likely. And so that's that story. So I don't know where that went, Christina. We sort of, I lost track of it, but that was quite a dramatic example. Sorry,
Yeah,
Rich,
absolutely.
if I cut into what you were going to say.
No, and it took so much time and effort. Again, the municipal officials on the call. In this case, even Neil in his volunteer capacity, wrote me in a very extensive report that we had to follow up on. I had multiple calls back and forth between the homeowner, the original tree company, the one they contracted it out to. So again, getting the word out about your requirements and hopefully preventing as much of this as possible. As we all know, it's going to happen. So having a process in place for when it does. For these without permit work, it happens in zoning and construction all over in the municipality, but working together when it does. Rich, do you have any experience when going out and with stumps to determine how big the trees may have been that are removed to determine a replacement cost?
If the stumps are still there, it's easy. You do the cross-section measurement and use that as a base. I've been nice. I've measured it, got the average stump size, and deducted an inch for the taper. That's been like the best tool to have. If you don't have the stumps anymore, then you have to rely on old pictures like Google Earth pictures or surrounding trees that are on the same property to give you a rough idea of what you're dealing with.
Thank you. And there's a link, it'll be in the slide to the Parcel Explorer for NJMAP2 that we talked about in this section. So a few minutes remaining, we have some additional content to get through, so we're going to go a bit faster, but hopefully still giving you an idea here. We want to talk about including an appeal process in your ordinance. So if you're going to have a permit process, you can approve it or deny it. So if someone does not agree with the decision on their permit, there has to be a process, just like with a zoning permit, for somebody to appeal that action. So in Reddington Township, our tree ordinance is part of the land use code section. So the appeals are handled very similarly to that of a zoning officer decision appeal, and they go to the Board of Adjustment. So they have, if we deny a permit, and the homeowner or applicant has an issue with that, their remedy is to apply to our Board of Adjustment at the township. So I refer them to the board secretary for the application documents, and she'll walk them through what that appeal process would be. So that is their remedy in Reddington Township. And Renee, would you speak to what it was in Bernardsville, please?
Sure. So
for you.
In Bernardsville, it was in their general code. Therefore, it was an appeal that went before the town council. And in this case, I had an appeal that actually was the neighbor of the individual that got an approved permit to remove a pretty large sugar maple that was in the front yard. So with the appeal process, you know, they did have to notify, as per the ordinance, 10 days of the written decision, so of the approval that I had provided. And then 30 days after, they could do the appeal. They would provide it to the clerk, and then the clerk would put it on the agenda for the town council to then figure out the decision to move forward, whether they were going to agree with it or disagree. So in this case, they did agree with the approved permit. The way that they saw it was that there were no code or section that referred to that they could not remove the tree, and that they were obligated to do replacements, which was part of the approval. They did have conditions to meet with the replacement schedule that is within the ordinance. So with that said, that's kind of how that went through with the process.
Right. And for those of you that are working with an ordinance now, a lot of your job may be speaking to the neighbors that they're not happy about the removal that took place, even when permit is issued. They are following all the guidelines. They're doing the proper replacement, or they're paying into the fund, but they miss that buffer, between neighbors, or that tree that they saw every time they turned onto the street. So while they may have not been acting outside of what they were permitted to do, and it's all in the ordinance, you still may have to field those questions or these appeals, even when all the ordinance requirements are followed. But you include that process in there. We want to highlight some other items you might want to consider in your ordinance. Again, you can customize it how you want, as long as you're meeting the minimum permit standard requirements set by the NJDEP. You might want to consider a permit expiration date. There might be a time frame that the permit is good for, or that the replanting has to take place within. You may want to require a notice of commencement when the tree removal or planting is going to happen. We have that in the Reddington ordinance. They're supposed to notify us ahead of time. That does not always happen, but you'll have to determine how important, I guess, that part of it might be to your municipality. We already talked about proper justification, and in your exemptions section, what you may want to note specifically what you're going to accept, maybe what a professional needs to issue that for you to accept it, or if you're going to have to go out and inspect on site to confirm that. And then implanting details and standards. And we have a few slides, I know we're at time now, that kind of go through some of these planting details and standards that might be important to include. Maybe not in your actual ordinance, but to make we talked about education, providing these resources to your applicants and maybe with your permit forms. So Neil, if you want to just quickly walk us through these next few here.
Yeah, and in this case, I got these slides simply to show that one of the things that we learned from an application was that our land use planner, the applicant suggested putting in some trees that were no longer suitable. Colorado blue spruces don't do well here anymore, and nor do Douglas firs. They were specified, so we changed those trees. But the land use planner suggested more shade trees, trees that would get bigger, at which point we realized that soil volume had to be in the ordinance, because as also this applicant wanted to put a large building, they did not want to pay into the escrow fund, so they wanted to put more and larger trees and progressively less soil volume. So what you see in the picture on the left is just where there's enough soil volume to support those trees. And on the right, in tree pits, or what we used to call sidewalk coffins, you see trees that were planted the same day don't have enough soil volume. So we put it in the ordinance, or we will be. And on the right, you see that we put in an approximate, a guesstimate. You have to start somewhere. So for a tree that will become only a small tree, you want maybe 120 cubic feet. So for a medium tree, and that is obviously, that is an arbitrary designation. What's a medium tree? You might think a magnolia or an apple or a dogwood. You'd want 500. If you're going to put in a shade tree, an oak, a hickory, something that becomes big, you want enough room for it to live, because otherwise you will get, as is typical in urban settings, a tree that lasts 7 years. That is the average life of an urban tree, due to one problem of soil volume. And it's a case we brought up earlier, is what is the functional life of a tree in your landscape compared to the biological? If you want an oak to live to be 60 years, you're going to need to give it soil volume. So you probably want to look into that. And there is plenty online to work from about these things. So these are things that a lot of people don't think of. We'll replace 50 trees and we'll put them in a quarter-acre yard. That's probably not going to work. So you need to have somebody that can help you think through these things so that you can get trees that survive. So you have that word that we all love these days, sustainability.
Thank you. And the next one is for a tree protection zone and critical root zone.
Yeah, same story. That the idea is, if you have development, one of the things we brought up briefly in previous sessions was, if most people cannot see what's going on below ground, including people with LTE or track qualifications, what goes on below ground is critical. And so if development or construction or damage occurs below ground, you would like to be able to prevent it, because, and we brought this up briefly earlier, damage to the root system may kill the tree, but it might not kill it for 10 years. You'll often gradually see decline, and then there's no accountability. We can try to write it into our ordinances to say, we think this was a problem when we observed it, and we will hold you to this as a homeowner for if the tree dies, you will be responsible. I bet you that's going to be tough in court, but biologically, it's very sound. So what you can do is not put a snow fence within an inch or two of the stem, but put a chain link fence out to the drip line. There used to be a rule of thumb that you would like to have a tree protection zone out to about 5 times the diameter of the tree, until more research was done and found out that the tree will become exceptionally susceptible to drought out to about the drip line, so the edge of the crown. So if you start letting construction come inside the drip line of a mature tree, you don't risk necessarily that tree falling over. You do run the risk of having that tree get killed, especially in the weather we now have, which is excessively wet, then excessively dry. So we've had a couple of very dry summers, and all of a sudden that tree, where someone might tell you, I didn't do any damage to the roots, then the tree dies. And they did. But that's the reason for the protection zone. So you'll see the critical root zone, the tree protection zone. I've used terms like the tree and soil protection zone because, as someone eloquently put it, when you drive over soil, it becomes dirt and it doesn't support tree roots. And it only takes one person or one car going back and forth under a tree a few times to get it as compacted as it ever will be and won't support root growth. So a tree protection zone in development is a terrific idea if you have development in an area where there are trees you would like to preserve.
Thanks, Neil. And with some of this stuff, when you're on site inspecting some of this work, this is the feedback you're giving to me of, is out there, they're doing damage to the existing trees, they're working too closely, all this kind of stuff. Then I get in touch with the applicant or the developer and make them aware of this. I mean, sometimes you're speaking to them on site, but that's why it's important to have communication with the person conducting your inspections at your municipality if it's not consistent throughout the process. To best practices, and sometimes they're not aware that they're causing damage. We've had issues also where trunks are being buried and things like that, where we get in contact with them while they're doing the work to help them improve how they're working on the site to protect the existing trees. I think we have one more detail here for proper planting.
Okay. The issue here is I had made this up for a PowerPoint. But the truth is that the biggest problem with tree longevity in any landscape is deep planting. The trees are not fence posts. Trees are not telephone poles. What you see in those two arrows near the base of the tree where it says trunk flare, top of root ball, above landscape soil, that's critical in survival. The other things I'll mention is often as not, before our planning board, I have changed the landscape plans, which tend to be boilerplate over and over and over. Peat moss is not recommended anywhere. It tends to be hydrophobic after it's been dried out. And so don't volcano mulch. Don't put mulch against the trunk. That's another sin, and no more than 2-3 inches of mulch and not against the trunk. Staking and guying, as you see in the picture, basically has fallen out of favor because either it's not removed or the tree doesn't get to move enough and the tree develops taper and strength by moving in the breeze. So if it has a decent root system planted properly, we don't recommend staking. If you're planting a balled and burlap tree with a wire basket, take the wire basket off, take the burlap off. But there are other kinds of trees, container trees and bare root trees out there now, but it's very typical to plant balled and burlap trees. So the idea is don't mess with the hole. Put arborist wood chips are the best mulch on top. And no more than 2 or 3 inches deep, and make sure that the flare where the roots exit the stem is above grade. That's the biggest thing.
Thank you, Neil. This is a very comprehensive planting detail. And something like this may be a resource that you provide. This could be on your EC page, your Shade Tree Commission page. It maybe you hand it out when people have to do replanting. People are spending, or residents, applicants, a significant amount of money in some cases to replant, generally in their own yard. They want the survivability. They want to do a good job, and they might not know these proper things, or the contractor or landscaper that they've hired is maybe not going to do it this way. So this is some additional information, some education resources you can provide to residents. All right, so this just a resource slide that we want to include. This is resources for some funding opportunities. This was provided by the outreach coordinator from NJ Shade Tree. So we'll include this in the slide deck. You can look through this at your leisure. I know we're running over of some opportunities for some different grants and things like that that might be available to your municipality, both in New Jersey and some national things. We want to highlight from session 1 specifically when we talked about the NJDEP requirement and how you can comply with the requirement for all municipalities to have a tree removal and replacement ordinance. There was a lot of questions about if your municipality was participating with NJ urban community forestry and how that would work. This is a clarifying statement that we just wanted to put out for anybody that was confused about that involvement. So if you participate there, that if you have an NJUCF program involvement, they don't require your municipality to have a tree protection ordinance to be accredited with them. So therefore, working with them does not exempt your municipality from this requirement to adopt a tree removal and replacement ordinance. So you can read that in more detail, but just to give some clarification to those questions that were coming in from session 1, we're including that in the slides here. So I know we've gone over our time for today, and I appreciate that the vast majority of you have hung on here. I'm looking at the numbers as we go through this. I know we covered a lot of material, and the overarching theme really is you have to design a process that will work for your municipality. The resources that you have, the bandwidth you may have in your different offices for how much you're going to ask for in an application process, the inspection schedules you might set. Do you have volunteers you can loop in? Are you going to have to hire a consultant? What are your fees going to be? I mean, there's a lot of things to consider. So our takeaway, hopefully to all of you, is take a step back, look at your process holistically of what you're looking to accomplish, and then loop in the proper stakeholders and departments to hopefully make this successful. But be prepared and willing to revisit your process, your ordinance, and make improvements as you go along. Do keep a running list of improvements that could be made, or like Renee referenced, there was a developer they worked with a lot, a contractor, made a recommendation for their form that would make it easier. That's something you might want to include. So be open to feedback, take those opportunities to improve as you go through the process. What you come up with right away may not be what's going to work for you long term. And just to close out some of the housekeeping, we're able to verify your attendance with the Zoom report. We will be releasing the certificates each separately for each of the sessions that you might have attended. You'll get that via email. Do be patient with us as we work through that. We've had an overwhelming response here, so we do have a lot of administrative work to do on our ends to get that all out there. We will be sending the post-session email with a recording from today, the PowerPoint slides, and links to the resources that we mentioned. So if you don't see that by tomorrow evening, please check your spam and junk. And also you're able to reach out if you have any questions. I want to thank our panel today for being with us. Thank you to Rich, to Neil, to Renee. And behind the scenes, we have Emily from NJ Shade Tree helping us out with the Q&A and such. It's been a privilege to partner with NJ Shade Tree on this. And thank you to all of you for your enthusiasm about the topic and sticking with us, most of you, for 3 full sessions here. I hope we gave you a comprehensive overview of the requirement, your ability to customize, and now some ideas and at least things to think about as you implement an enforcement process and an application process in your community. So thank you to everyone and enjoy the rest of your day.
And Christina, thank you to you for putting it together.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Christina. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Have a great one, everyone.
The signing off.